Well, good afternoon, everyone, and let me give you a very warm welcome to our final webinar in our Lunchtime Oil and Gas series for in-house lawyers. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Smith, and I'm a Director at Burness Paull in the Oil and Gas team, and I'll be moderating our session today. Our speakers this afternoon are Andrew Knight and Lynn Moss, and they'll be considering where we are now in terms of the COVID vaccinations and the reopening of workplaces. They will also be considering what your health and safety obligations are in relation to coronavirus safe workplaces and the legal risks of making vaccinations mandatory for staff. But before I hand over to Andrew and Lynn, I just want to make you aware of a few housekeeping points. You should have all been put on mute automatically as you entered the webinar, but if you could please just make sure you keep yourself on mute throughout to limit any background noise, then that would be greatly appreciated. After the presentations, we hope to have a short Q&A session, so please do send any questions that you may have in via the chat function at any point, and we'll try to cover off as many of those questions as we can at the end. Please note that the session is being recorded, and we will circulate the recordings of this session and the 3 previous webinars to you in the early part of next week. By way of introduction to our speakers, Lynn is a director in our dispute resolution team with a focus on health and safety and environmental law and corporate crime. Her work includes assisting clients with their investigations into health and safety or environmental breaches, as well as liaising with the regulators on their behalf. Andrew is a senior associate in our employment division, and he advises on full spectrum of both contentious and non-contentious employment matters. And so without any further delay, I'll now hand over to them for the presentation.
Thanks very much, David, for the warm introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming along. It was great to see some familiar names on the list of attendees, and some folks I've not had the opportunity to work with before, so welcome. For me, one good thing to have come out of lockdown is the ease with which we can host these types of sessions and can all participate from the comfort of our own homes without the need to lose time either side to traveling. You all have the additional benefit of not having to sit with your cameras on, so you can munch away on a sandwich or, do what you will. We're unfortunately in focus all throughout the session. We do appreciate, how intense it can be, and I'm sure you have all come in having had Teams and Zoom calls all day. So we really do appreciate you giving up your time to join this session and hope that you can get something out of it. Before we delve into the legal complexities around vaccinations, I'd like to start with some statistics. As of yesterday in Scotland, 2,789,978 people had received the first dose of the Pfizer, Moderna or Astrazeneca vaccine, and a further just over 1.142 million had received their second dose. In England, we have over 28 million people having received their first dose and over 11 million people having received their second dose. Irrespective of your political persuasions or how you feel the governments of the United Kingdom have responded to the pandemic in general, I think we can all agree that this is a monumental achievement. I suspect the majority of you on this call are joining from Scotland, and we obviously have further cause for positivity this week as pubs, cafes and restaurants have reopened, albeit with alcohol only being served outdoors and the Scottish weather responding appropriately by going back to wintry conditions. Now, with the easing of restrictions, your organisations will already be considering what the future looks like in terms of your office premises. In many ways, this is a really exciting opportunity to embrace things like flexible working and to be creative in exploring ways of delivering a work-life balance for your staff while still ensuring the productivity of your business. However, I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that the workplaces of the majority of your personnel have been open right throughout the pandemic. bearing in mind that your offshore operations are undertaken in some of the most challenging environments conceivable from a COVID perspective, in terms of confined areas, shared eating, cleaning and sleeping facilities, access to medical facilities and testing. I think Lynn and I and everyone on this call would share the view that it's truly remarkable that the industry has been able to keep going in these conditions. And I think it's really testament to the resilience of the industry and its ability to adapt to challenging situations. So on that note of positivity, what do we intend to cover at today's session? Well, as the title suggests, our focus is going to be on the vaccination programme and what that means in terms of your workforces, both onshore and offshore. We'll consider that in the context of your health and safety obligations as employers and having regard to the legal issues which arise from an employment law and data privacy perspective. Our title, No Jab, No Job, has been taken from some very public campaigns from organisations such as Pimlico Plumbers, which say they intend to introduce a policy of only recruiting those who have been vaccinated. Clearly, from a business perspective, there will be a considerable benefit in having the workforce vaccinated. It should lead to a more productive workforce with less time lost to illness. It'll be beneficial in terms of reducing risk when your workforce are interacting with your customers and clients. And from a moral perspective, we all want our employees and workforces fit and well. On the other hand, there is a strong feeling amongst some individuals and pressure groups that they should not be forced to have the vaccination, and this has become a hotly debated issue. There are undoubtedly significant legal risks here, but also PR issues, which are not easy to grapple with. Throughout the pandemic, we've become accustomed to the UK and devolved governments reacting slowly in terms of issuing detailed guidance and legislation. And as a result, employers have been forced to make important business decisions, often with limited governmental guidance. We saw this with the job retention scheme, and I'm afraid we're seeing this again when it comes to the issues of vaccines and whether they'll be mandated for any sectors. There's currently no legislation which makes the vaccine mandatory for anyone, and the only sector within which the UK government is consulting on making the vaccination a requirement is in relation to those working in older adult care homes. So in the absence of legislation or indeed clear government guidance, it's left to employers to grapple with this extremely complex issue. Unfortunately, there are no easy answers to this. We hope this session can provide you with some guidance as to the sorts of things you should be considering, but there really is no one-size-fits-all approach. This session's not a substitute for giving these issues some real thought in the context of your own organisation and seeking specific legal advice. So on that health warning, Lynn, can I pass to you to set out the framework from a health and safety perspective that employers need to work to?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Andrew, for that great introduction and an general overview of where we are. As Andrew said, we don't claim to know all the answers, but hopefully after this you'll have more of an understanding of the issues involved and some of the challenges which we think will face the industry as we tackle the vaccination rollout, and also the return to the physical workplace, which for a lot of your offices onshore you'll be thinking about quite heavily at the moment. I'm going to take you through your health and safety obligations as far as COVID is concerned, and how I think the availability of the vaccine could affect those duties. So overall, COVID hasn't really changed your overarching duties in relation to ensuring the health, safety and welfare of your employees and any others that are affected by the work that you do, such as contractors or the self-employed. And most of you here will probably be familiar with the general requirements of health and safety law in the UK. However, there's no doubt that COVID has placed an additional burden on employers in the past year, and the oil and gas sector is no exception to that. There's unique challenges faced by the industry in relation to travel, both intra-UK and abroad. Different companies are working on the same installation or vessel, and they're all having to communicate with one another and manage risks, as well as crew changes and rotations, which have also obviously been heavily affected by the pandemic. But as Andrew said at the start, I think the oil and gas sector has responded, tremendously well to all of this, and has been really resilient over the last year. Even for those working onshore, most individuals have been working from home, and that brings with it additional risks in terms of ergonomics, work-related stress, and overall mental and physical well-being. There may have been circumstances, exceptional circumstances, which have justified a presence in the office over various points. And the challenge there has been to ensure that there are sufficient measures in place to reduce the risk of transmission in the workplace. So we're now at the point where the Scottish and the UK governments are easing restrictions again. We've been talking about the summer as a possible time for offices to start returning to work on a phased basis. We've still got offshore workers moving around frequently as well, so that isn't changing. And we also have something else which could again change the risk landscape, and that is the vaccine rollout programme. So how does all this fit in terms of your overall obligations? So as employers, you've got a duty to take reasonably practicable steps to ensure the health, safety and welfare at work of all of your employees, and to prevent or reduce exposure to workplace risks. And that doesn't just relate to your own employees, but it also relates to contractors and others who might be visiting your premises, either onshore or offshore. And those workplace risks include risks relating to COVID. Employees also have a duty to take steps to ensure their own health and safety, and that includes cooperating with any measures that their employers put in place to control health and safety risks in the workplace. I think it's worth mentioning that as well as the duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act and the overall regime in the UK, there is also a separate obligation on businesses under the Scottish coronavirus regulations to take steps to reduce the risk of transmission of the virus. So it's definitely something that employers should have full focus on and that they shouldn't ignore. So how does all this work in practice? You've got your overarching duty, which is a goal-setting duty. It's not a prescriptive, here are the steps you must take to comply with the law. So what you need to do is really identify risks in your workplace. So you should be carrying out, as a minimum, a risk assessment and reviewing that on a regular basis. And that includes when there is any significant changes to the situation. And one of those changes could be the fact that the vaccine's now available. The Health and Safety Executive, and for offshore workplaces, quite often the Offshore Safety Directive regulator, is carrying out spot checks on employers and will address non-compliance by way of the giving of advice or even enforcement action in cases of a serious breach of the law. But it's important to bear in mind that even if you do have a case of transmission in the workplace or even a full outbreak, having a risk assessment in place and an audit trail of what you've done to reduce the risks will go a long way to providing you with a defence to any enforcement action that could follow. So in practice, your risk assessment should ideally identify any of the hazards which are present in your workplace in terms of COVID. You should identify who in the workplace could be harmed and how. You should then work out the likelihood of those people being harmed, and then identify any control measures that you need to put in place to either eliminate or reduce the likelihood of that harm occurring to a reasonably practicable or acceptable level. In terms of the vaccine, it may be a reasonably practicable measure to encourage your employees to be vaccinated to ensure that you as the employer comply with your health and safety duties. However, I think if the employee doesn't take the vaccine for whatever reason, that's unlikely to be a breach of the employee's own health and safety duties. To justify mandating vaccination for your workers, in terms of health and safety law, you would need to demonstrate that taking that step of mandating is the most reasonably practicable way by which to reduce the risks. And you'd need to balance that against all of the risks from an employment law perspective, which Andrew's going to talk about shortly. Some of the issues that could crop up, the fact that some employees might be vaccinated and others might not, could create some issues for employers. Some employees might be uncomfortable working alongside colleagues who have not been vaccinated. The offshore workforce is also higher risk due to individuals often travelling all over the world. And again, here, risk assessment really is key to identifying what you need to do. Many employers are based in the UK, but they manage operations all over the world. And management and tracking of the vaccine rollout in other countries will be affected by factors such as that particular country's own vaccination programme and the availability of the vaccine there. Private vaccines could be an option, but that will depend on availability and logistics of that. What is clear is that the availability of the vaccine will undoubtedly change the risk profile of COVID-19 in your workplace. And you should, as a minimum, be reviewing your current risk assessments and any of your control measures that you've got in place to assess whether there are any additional risks that you need to be aware of and whether you need to put in place any further control measures. In terms of health and safety law, consultation with your workforce is also key. For example, are you able to identify those who are vaccine hesitant and encourage them to speak to occupational health or similar if they have any concerns? You do have an obligation as an employer to consult with your workforce on any issues affecting health and safety, and evidence that you've done that will again contribute to a stronger defence in the event of enforcement action being taken. I should also point out that health and safety management should be a priority at board meetings, and any issues related to COVID should be being discussed and decided upon at board level. It is important to bear in mind that individual managers or directors can also face prosecution for health and safety breaches alongside the organisation itself. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of health and safety law as regards to COVID and particularly the vaccines. Andrew, can you take us through perhaps some of the legal risks from an employment law perspective, particularly in relation to mandating the vaccine? What
Sure,
are those risks?
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the risks and issues are multiple, both from an employment law and data protection perspective. We only have a time to consider a few of those today. I think before getting into the legal risks, there's obviously some real practical issues here around mandating of the vaccine, and probably foremost in those are, well, how do you actually verify whether someone has had a vaccine? There are obviously well publicised discussions ongoing about all 4 UK countries joining a digital vaccination passport programme, mostly for international travel, and that's proving to be a very controversial issue. But my understanding is we're some way away from that now. So from an employment law perspective, the rub of mandating comes when you have to deal with objectors, and adopting a zero tolerance policy could lead to both employment tribunal claims and bad publicity. In the absence of legislation, guidance, or even case law, I think looking at the public mood is potentially a good barometer of how such a policy might be viewed. And there's certainly no unanimous public support for the mandating of vaccines. And what I mentioned earlier of vaccine passports being introduced has faced considerable resistance from both the public and within the House of Commons. You'll have seen reports that there's now a group of more than 70 cross-party MPs who've launched a campaign against the vaccine passport. So from an employment law perspective, the risks will be different for different groups. So for new recruits, the risks will be different than from your existing workforces. For both groups, however, it's important to bear in mind that there are exemptions that apply to the vaccine, and it would of course be crucial to identify if they did apply in any case before you took steps as an employer. For existing employees, there could be risks of unfair dismissal claims, obviously only where employees have 2 years or more service, and also risks of indirect discrimination claims. And then for anyone else, so employees with less than 2 years service, new recruits, as well as non-employees within your workforces, such as 0 hours workers and contractors, there's no unfair dismissal risk, but there is still potentially a risk of indirect discrimination claims. So looking at unfair dismissal, first of all, the key test will be whether dismissal is a reasonable response to a refusal to get vaccinated. And reasonableness will always be judged in the particular context of your business and the role performed by the employee. So they'll be judged on a case-by-case basis. And I think it will be crucial for the business to be able to demonstrate that there are cogent business reasons for your business taking the approach that it has, why you consider it to be necessary for this particular employee to be vaccinated in order to perform their role, that you've given consideration to the reasons they have provided for not wishing to be vaccinated, and that you've considered alternatives to dismissal. I think much like you've said, Lynn, in the context of health and safety, 2 things which are going to be absolutely critical here are your workplace risk assessment and the consultation process you've undertaken with employees. Demonstrating that you've engaged with your workforce is absolutely key. The workforce need to understand the reasons for your approach and also have the opportunity to make representations. Where there are concerns from individuals about getting the vaccine, we would recommend a sympathetic approach. Discuss with the individual, try to understand the basis for their concerns, and provide them with access to information and advice, perhaps via your occupational health providers. Just as a really practical example of what you might do, at Burness Paul, actually, we had a Q&A session delivered to all staff by Dr. Roland Aldridge on the vaccination programme. So Dr. Aldridge is a surgical consultant who worked alongside Johnson & Johnson on their vaccine, and he was involved in setting up Glasgow Royal Infirmary's COVID-19 wards, and he ran them in the first peak. So things like that, I think, to help disseminate information to the workforce and put their minds at ease is always going to be helpful. A process of consultation should obviously target the workforce directly, but it's important not to forget about other stakeholders such as trade unions, and if you have any sort of permanent body of employee reps, anything like that, involve them. As I said before, consideration needs to be given to the circumstances of the individual employee and their role. So a question to ask is, do they, in order to perform their role, actually need to be vaccinated? This is probably more likely to be the case for employees working in confined offshore environments than it is for your office-based staff. If following engagement an employee refuses to get vaccinated, as I said, you should consider whether there are any alternatives to dismissal before going down that route. So perhaps look at alternative roles, home working, lone working, anything like that. Obviously, give consideration to industry and expert guidance. It may be that there will be sector-specific guidance from the government for oil and gas, but there's no sign of that as yet. There was an OG UK position paper published in December 2020 on the vaccine, which said a few things which I think are of interest. So it suggests that operationally industry should be aware of the false presumption that the vaccination has produced total immunity. I think that goes hand in hand with what you say, Lynn, here, that vaccination is not a solution in and of itself. The paper suggested that some employers may feel it necessary to considering mandating the vaccine. However, you would need to give careful consideration to ethical, employment law and legal liability issues. So obviously seeking advice is going to be key. And it went on to say, look, the industry should not assume that a national vaccination programme will of itself remove the need for other measures like those you've talked about, Lynn. As I mentioned, there is also an Acas Guidance note which is worth consulting, and it recommends that employers should support staff in getting the vaccine when offered to them by doing things like paying for time off to attend the appointment, supporting absence if an employee has any side effects triggered by the vaccine. So if you had, for example, an absence related system that has trigger points, then don't include an absence caused by a reaction to the vaccine within that system, and speak to employees about their concerns. The Acas Guidance says that it's better to support employees around the vaccine rather than making it a requirement of their jobs. However, if an employer does think it's necessary for a job, then, as I've said, they should consult with the employees and other stakeholders like unions. And ideally, the stance should be set out in a workplace policy. And again, the Acas Guidance essentially recommends a sympathetic approach, looking at individual circumstances and having a discussion with the employee. So, the Acas Guidance is in fairly general terms, and what it doesn't say, although it recommends not making it a requirement of the job, it doesn't say that cannot happen. Which is interesting in of itself. So if following all of these considerations, a decision is ultimately taken to go down a dismissal route, then there is the potential for the employee's refusal to get the vaccine to be categorized as misconduct. However, I think we would be cautious about recommending taking that approach. Labeling an employee's refusal to get a vaccine as gross misconduct may be seen as draconian by a tribunal, and it's not really consistent with the Acas Guidance. The better approach in these circumstances may be for this to be categorized as a dismissal for some other substantial reason justifying dismissal, SOSR, as you'll have heard it being referred to before, and that would be a dismissal with notice. So turning then to issues of indirect discrimination. In broad terms, indirect discrimination can occur where an employer applies a provision, criterion, or practice to its entire workforce or prospective workers, and this has a disproportionately adverse impact upon a particular protected group. So a policy of mandating vaccines for your workforce and or new recruits would very likely amount to a provision, criterion, or practice. So there would next be a requirement for those impacted to demonstrate both that they have a protected characteristic and that those within that protected group have been disadvantaged by the policy. So in the context of the vaccine, there are a number of potentially relevant protected characteristics. Obviously, age, on the basis that younger members of the population will not have access to the vaccine until later on. Also potentially religious or philosophical belief, which is an interesting area in the context of some of the anti-vax groups that we've seen forming. So what qualifies as a philosophical belief is not well defined in our equality legislation, and it's been largely left to the courts to set out the law around that. A number of criteria have been set out over time which must be considered when identifying if something amounts to a philosophical belief protected in law. Of particular relevance to the vaccine and anti-vax groups would be the necessity for the belief to have a certain level of cogency, seriousness, cohesion, and importance, and for the belief system to be worthy of respect in a democratic society. What I would say is there's been a tendency in recent years within the courts and tribunals towards an extension of what amounts to a philosophical belief. So we've seen things like a deeply held belief in Scottish independence being held by a tribunal to meet the test. And in another case, ethical veganism was held to amount to a philosophical belief. I wonder if some of the recent developments around the Astrazeneca vaccine are quite relevant here. Obviously, a number of countries have taken different approaches to the vaccine as a result of the link that's been established between the vaccine and rare blood clots. So we've seen Denmark banning the vaccine. We've seen Germany limiting the routine use of the vaccine to those 60 and above, whereas in the UK, a slightly different approach has been taken where an alternative vaccine is being recommended, but only for those under the age of 30. So with the differences in approach being taken, there's potentially scope for those in a particular age group to take the view that being vaccinated is not potentially safe for them, and forming quite strong views about that. So it will be interesting to see how matters develop in that area. So assuming that one of your existing workforce or a job applicant is able to demonstrate that they are part of a protected group and that they've been disadvantaged by a policy of mandating, there is a potential defence available to employers. So in order to defend such a policy, you would have to demonstrate that it's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Now, clearly here there is a legitimate aim, which is the protection of the health and safety of your workforce, your customers and your clients. But the real challenge would be demonstrating that the mandating of the vaccine was a proportionate means of achieving that. And like Lynn has said, this would rely upon robust evidence from your risk assessment that this was the most reasonably practicable way of reducing the risk, and that you'd consulted with the workforce about these measures. So just to conclude on some of the employment risks before moving on to look at the GDPR angle, I think given the internationally mobile nature of oil and gas, it may be very difficult in practice to implement a zero tolerance policy, given, as Lynn says, the disparity at which the vaccine is being rolled out across nations and even within nations throughout different populations. Also, as Lynn has said, one has to consider the other measures which are in place to reduce the risk. Now, oil and gas is one of the most advanced sectors in terms of its testing and quarantine regimes. There's a medical assessment tool that's being used, COVID age, and many platforms have remained operational throughout. So the sector is advanced in terms of its implementation of other risk reduction measures. But clearly, many of these measures have a significant cost implication, and the current approach may not therefore be sustainable forever. So, you know, as things develop, potentially the vaccination becomes a much more relevant weapon in your arsenal against some of the risks here. Lynn, I wonder if that's an appropriate point for you to come in and just talk briefly about some of the quarantine and testing issues that you've seen.
Yeah, talk of quarantine and isolation might send shivers down the spines of some of you attending, especially those in HR and logistics roles. The rules are not straightforward, and I can't imagine the headaches that you've all had with having to grapple with the rules and move people around and just manage people. It must just be so difficult. The quarantine rules and isolation and testing might feed into your vaccination strategy, albeit indirectly. And as I've said, the rules and regulations are far from clear. I'm not going to give you a full breakdown because they've probably changed since I looked at them last night, so I hope they haven't. I could do a whole webinar on these probably separately, but I think what's clear is that there's potentially different rules depending on whether you're an offshore worker who travels to England or to Scotland, either to work or when returning from a rotation abroad. And there's also been confusion around isolation requirements for seafarers. And again, with guidance appearing to be different in Scotland than in England. Oil and gas offshore workers will be used to being tested before travel, and whilst offshore, they've been doing that for over a year. There's been more talk in the media about lateral flow devices, or LFDs, and these are now available to every household in Scotland for asymptomatic testing. So when assessing the risks of transmission in the workplace and the effects of the vaccine, particularly where some employees are vaccinated and some aren't, employers might identify lateral flow testing as a reasonably practicable measure which they can take to reduce the risk of transmission, both onshore and offshore, I guess. However, care should be taken on how heavy a reliance is placed on the results. My understanding, and obviously I'm not medically trained, but I understand that LFDs could still produce a negative result, even if the individual is carrying the virus. And so for this reason, I would certainly caution against LFDs as being used as a substitute for other risk reduction measures, at least at the moment, until we understand how they work a little bit more. And again, your risk assessment results will be important in identifying whether LFDs can play a part in reducing the risk of transmission in your workplace. And availability of the supply of LFDs will also be a factor, but hopefully they are widely available now, at least in Scotland. And I know that they're being made available in England as well. I think the main point that I'm trying to make here is that there is uncertainty around travel restrictions and isolation. And the fact that testing can also be quite invasive and quite daunting, even if you're doing it all the time. You know, you may be saying, oh gosh, I've got to stick this thing up my nose again. And you know, it can get quite stressful. And I suppose all of that can lead to stress and anxiety amongst your workforce in itself. And I think that's only going to be exacerbated by any issues that come up as a result of your stance on the vaccine. So again, it's more about considering it in the round and how it's going to affect your workforce. And risk assessment and consultation, as we've said throughout, is definitely key to that. I'll hand back over to Angie now.
Thanks, Lynn. Yes, just picking up on that theme of what should you be doing and ways of mitigating risks. I think some of the steps that we would suggest are, as we've already discussed, a robust process of consultation and engagement with staff and other key stakeholders, dealing with concerns sympathetically, risk assessments, evidence of having considered alternatives and why they're not feasible if you decide to go down the route of mandating, potentially evidence of the number of vulnerable people within your organization which you need to protect, and obviously, you know, critically following the science here, which is developing you know, quicker than we can often keep up with. It might perhaps be easier to justify a strict policy of mandating if it's supported by the position of a third party, perhaps your clients, perhaps your insurers. Lynn, have you seen any examples of insurers requiring the vaccine?
No, not yet. I haven't seen myself examples, but one thing I am aware of, which is not, it's slightly different, but I'm aware of insurers requiring companies to keep records related to the COVID measures that they've been taking, like particularly keeping things like occupational health records or risk assessments. And that's really, I think the thinking there is to head off any potential you know, long tail claims that might come up, particularly in relation to long COVID. But my own view is that I don't think it'll be long before we start seeing claims about long COVID. I don't think they're going to have anything like the lead time that we see on things like asbestos or noise-induced hearing loss claims. I think if people have got long COVID, they're probably going to know by now if they've got it. And then the keeping of records obviously throws up issues in relation to GDPR, and Andrew will talk about that later. In relation to whether there's a strict policy with your insurer, I would urge you to really check with your insurers about whether that is a requirement. Check the terms of your policy and to see what they say, but you know, it isn't beyond the realms of possibility that it could end up creeping into policy documents. So it's worth discussing it with brokers and checking with your insurers as to whether that's going to be a requirement in the future.
What about private vaccination arrangements, Lynn? There's heard some chat around that. What's your thoughts on that?
So private vaccines, they might be a step that employers want to take to try and ensure the maximum take-up of the vaccine in their workforce. But I suppose that depends on availability of the vaccine and the employer's ability to source a supply. I have heard of some companies in the oil and gas industry that have done this just to make sure that their employees get access to it. It's not mandating, but it is just, you know, a bit like the flu jab. It's offering it up. But we hear in the media all the time stories about the vaccine supply slowing down as we get to the lower priority age groups in the general population. So whether there's going to be a private supply available is unclear at this stage. And I think an employer seeking to go down that route will also have to consider what steps they need to take to make sure that the vaccine is administered safely. So will the vaccinator attend your premises to vaccinate employees? If so, how do you ensure their safety and the safety of your employees? Do the vaccinators present an additional transmission risk? Or will you give your employees a voucher so they can go to a pharmacy, similar to what you do with the flu vaccine? I don't even know if that's possible to do that. So all of those things will need to be considered if you're thinking about offering it privately, but it's something that you can identify as a measure to take in your risk assessment process. But again, I would urge against sort of relying on that as the only measure to take to reduce the risk, but it is certainly something that I have heard of companies thinking about doing.
Thanks, Lynn. So I suppose just to kind of wrap up on that section and the risks that potentially present if you do decide to go down a mandating route, we're not saying it's not possible to mandate. I think what we are saying is at this stage, it would be practically very difficult, and there would be quite a number of risks in taking that approach. Obviously, as I said at the outset, it's a case-by-case basis, and the risk profile will be different depending on each workplace, organisation, and role. And it's likely that there'll be different considerations, obviously, for onshore and offshore workforces. In the absence of sector-specific guidelines, an employee encouragement programme may for now be the more effective way of approaching the vaccination. So that might include, providing independent support and help for employees who are unsure, access to occupational health and other expert advice. And as, the Acas Guidance recommends, potentially paid time off to get vaccines, perhaps even if the vaccination appointment is during rotated time on. I think it is possible to rearrange vaccination appointments, although NHS Scotland encourages you to make every effort to attend your appointment. So it's something to consider potentially. So turning away from strict employment tribunal risks, there is a whole other can of worms here, which is GDPR. Now, information related to whether or not someone has been vaccinated is health information, and that is a special category of personal data which has the greatest degree of protection under data privacy law. The Information Commissioner's Office website has a vaccination section that provides really helpful guidance, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. I think before gathering data around the vaccination status of your workforce, you must be clear that you have both a lawful basis and one of the prescribed grounds under the relevant legislation for processing that data. The ICO has emphasised that employers must have clear and compelling reasons for processing this data and must regularly review whether they have grounds for retaining the data, particularly as the vaccine rollout continues and numbers of cases decline. The guidance recognises that there may be more compelling cases for processing this data in particular sectors, and depending upon the type of work undertaken by staff and the particular health and safety risks in the workplace. But the ICO warns that employers should not record the data on a just-in-case basis. I think the key considerations are how much information do you need to know, and you should of course go no further than is absolutely necessary. Really critical is if you do take this information, how do you store it and what do you use it for? You must ensure that adequate measures are in place to protect that type of information. In practical terms, we would recommend that you engage with your data protection officer if you have one and seek legal advice before requesting and processing this type of data. It may be worthwhile giving consideration to completing a data protection impact assessment, and that's something that will allow you to work through whether you actually need to collect the information, and it's then helpful in demonstrating, what the grounds for collecting that data were and that you've been compliant. I think one thing we all need to brace ourselves for is difficult requests from employees who may look for assurance that those they're working with have had the vaccine. And I think that creates a really complex clash of health and safety, employment law, and data privacy issues. And I think if you do find yourself in a situation where you're being asked for that kind of information from your workforce, then you really should be seeking specialist advice. So that's just been a really brief whistle-stop tour of what is a really complicated area with lots of potential legal ramifications, and hopefully we've been able to go through things in a coherent way. I think we'd like to try and conclude by bringing what we've discussed together. As I say, there are a myriad of issues, and I'm conscious that we haven't even touched upon some of those. So we've not even considered, what happens now for your onshore workforces returning to the office, potential rise in flexible working requests and the like. I think all of those topics could merit a session in and of themselves. Lynn, what would you say are the key takeaways from a health and safety perspective?
Yeah, so I think my main message is your risk assessment is the most important thing from a health and safety point of view. And it's really the first step that you should take to identify any risks and to allow you to formulate a plan on what you're going to do to control those risks. I know that spot checks are being carried out by regulators, and the OSDR is looking at COVID measures during offshore inspections. So even routine inspections, they are looking at this stuff. So the key thing to remember is that any plan to mandate vaccines would need to be justified in your risk assessment, and you would need to have evidence that mandating was the most reasonably practicable measure available and that nothing else could be done. In those circumstances, you need to keep evidence that you'd considered other control measures but had discarded them, as well as the reasons why you've discarded them as possible control measures. Also, even if the majority of your workforce have been vaccinated, that's unlikely, at least for the time being, to be seen as a reasonably practicable measure on its own. And that all of the other measures that we've seen and we've been used to, like social distancing, mask wearing, reduced staffing levels and hand washing, I think they're going to be required for quite some time yet. So yes, risk assessment is really my main message today, I think. What about you, Andrew? From an employment perspective, what's your kind of key pointers?
Well, I think the first thing probably to say is when you're looking at this for your own business, a multidisciplinary task force is required. So obviously, directors have duties from a health and safety perspective, and I think this should be led by the board of businesses, but also it will need to involve internal and external legal, HR, data protection officers. In terms of real practical tips, I think we would recommend implementing a specific policy around vaccinations, which sets out how you're going to approach the vaccine, the reasons for that, how you look at exemptions, your approach to time off to get the vaccine, and your approach if someone becomes unwell following the vaccine. Related to this, I think a review of existing contractual documentation is going to be key, and that's the case also for your office-based staff who may be returning shortly. You may need to address issues like home working and return to office on set days as we all embrace the new approach to working. From a GDPR perspective, we would recommend you undertake a data protection impact assessment if considering gathering data around vaccines, and do consult the ICO website. I think we've both said here what is going to be absolutely critical is your engagement with the workforce. And I think your communication strategies around that and training that you might offer are all going to be really critical. As I've said, at this stage, we're not saying that you cannot mandate the vaccine, but there are some really tricky and difficult issues around that. So perhaps initially the focus should be on looking at ways of incentivizing the workforce to take the vaccine rather than penalizing them for not. And I think, it goes without saying here, given the legal risks, it is worthwhile seeking specialist legal advice before you decide to go down any one route. And on that note, I think, Lynn, you and I are both very engaged with clients on these issues, and very happy to speak to anyone who wants to contact us offline.
Absolutely, yeah.
But David, I think we've got a few minutes maybe for the Q&A. If there are any questions, I haven't seen any coming in on the chat function, but I don't know if there are any people want to ask.
Yeah, Lynn, Andrew, that was absolutely brilliant, guys. Thank you. Really helpful and practical. What's a really tricky matter. So thanks for covering that so well. We're going to move on, as Andrew said, onto the Q&A part of the session. So if you do have a question, then please do use the chat function to submit any questions you may have. We have received a couple of questions which have come in privately, so we can maybe field those first. Lynn, I think the first one is for you. What are the penalties for getting this wrong from a health and safety point of view?
Okay, so I think what I would say first of all to that is, in terms of health and safety, I don't think I'd be saying, that the HSE would be looking to penalise people who either mandate or don't mandate. I think, if you can justify one or the other, the HSE are not going to criticise you. I think where it may become a risk is where you don't do a risk assessment properly, or you don't identify all of the measures that you need to take, or you don't ensure that those control measures are working correctly. So it's all about the implementation, I think, the HSE are looking at, and that's where I think they may take enforcement action. And that the possibilities are anything from just a kind of informal letter warning somebody that, like, we think you've breached legislation, you might want to think about doing these things to remedy the breach, to enforcement notices, so either improvement or prohibition notices depending on the nature of the breach, all the way up to prosecution for really serious offences where they think there has been a breach of the law that is in the public interest to prosecute. And that could be in relation to an outbreak which has occurred in the workplace which hasn't been managed properly. I mentioned senior management as well. and individuals can also be prosecuted as well as a company. So it possibly, they could look at the individuals if there's something happening further up the chain that has contributed to a breach. So, and in those circumstances, the penalty is more often than not a criminal fine. Fines have been increasing in recent years. We've seen fines. I mean, this is you're talking about, offshore gas releases and oil discharges and things like that. But fines are on the increase, so that's definitely something to watch out for. For most serious offences, individuals can be imprisoned for up to 2 years, but we have seen that very rarely in Scotland, although it does happen. So I'm not going to say it never happens. But there's a range of options that the HSE can take. But I think, we're a year in. They've very much been looking at engaging with employers to try and make sure that they're doing things properly. But I think there's going to come a point where they're going to say, right, you've had long enough. It's time to, and I think they may start looking at enforcement perhaps once people get back into the swing of things by going back to work and things like that. So,
Sure.
So yeah, that's
brilliant. That's really helpful. Thank you. Andrew, I think we've got time for one for you. Do you think it's likely that the government will introduce mandatory vaccinations in any sectors?
I think it's really difficult to anticipate what the government is going to do, and I mean no real criticism in that, because it's obviously a very complex issue. As I said, there has been a consultation ongoing about introduction of this on a mandatory basis for those working in older adult care homes. And Boris Johnson was called to give evidence before the House of Commons Liaison Committee, and he was asked whether mandating would be compatible with a free society such as ours. And he pointed to the fact that it's not a totally alien concept. Surgeons, for example, when entrusted with the care of a patient, have to have the hepatitis B vaccine. And the Prime Minister said it would be, in his view, wholly irresponsible for care home companies to think of requiring vaccinations.